This is a bit about me. I'm sure you would have read the posters for this event, but very briefly, I'll just highlight certain aspects of my background. I have a PhD in petroleum economics, management and policy, focused on energy systems modeling. Previously, I worked with the Nigerian National Oil Company, where I dealt with assets evaluation and worked as a commercial lead in the ANOH Gas Processing Company, a joint venture between the NNPC and Seplat. And then I worked with the chief strategy officer as the lead technical assistant. And I also led project economics on several significant energy projects, within Nigeria. Currently, I'm a senior economist with the Ministry of Energy and Resources in Saskatchewan. I like to do modeling, fiscal analysis, commercial negotiations within the natural resource space. That's where my talents and skills lie. And I really utilize a lot of data in making my own assessments. So that's just a very quick overview of who I am. And for this topic, it's a very interesting one. And I know that we have a set amount of time within which I can present, and then we'll take up more discussions afterwards. But this is very quickly the outline of how we are going to be having this conversation. We're first of all going to set the scene, then we'll discuss the energy landscape. Then we'll look at the specific drivers of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity in the world as far as it relates to energy, and generally, even more broadly, what are the things that are driving all the volatility that we are seeing around the energy landscape. Then we'll have a look at what it takes to keep the lights on, especially from a Nigeria-centric or Afrocentric point of view. But you'll discover that the things that we require to keep the lights on in Nigeria are the very same things you require to keep the lights on in Canada, in Europe, or even in Asia. We'll take a look at the specific strategies that energy companies are adopting to navigate this volatile world. And then we'll have a look at the way forward, which is something like, okay, what can we do? What are the strategies that we can do, collectively as a nation or as a people to manage VUCA? Then I summarize it with some key takeaways. For our outline or presentation today, my preference would be that after I have gone through the presentation, we can then have questions and discussions around it. So this is setting the theme. The energy landscape today is really, really dynamic. Any piece of news you hear, any headline you come across would intersect with, any headline or piece of news you come across within the space of energy will intersect somehow with one of these elements that I have put up on the screen right now. So there was a question of the energy transition, right? How fast is it going? What is it going to cost? What are the issues around it? Okay. Then there are questions about energy demand. How much of it? Where is it coming from? In what forms are we going to demand energy? Is it going to be in the form of electricity? Is it going to be more liquids? Is gas going to play a role? Solar and wind, what role will they play? How about nuclear? Okay, so not only is the amount of energy demand of interest, also of interest is what forms of energy and where will those energies come from? Because the question of where those energies will come from will tie into the question of geopolitics, and we'll see that very soon. Then there's the oil price dynamic. Okay, is the oil price that we look out to the future sufficient to support investment? How about consumers? Oil and gas industry people, for example, like high oil prices because it incentivizes investments. Well, high oil prices also mean higher gasoline prices. Are consumers willing to pay that extra for it? How do producing countries balance their budgets? Okay, currently oil is at a certain level right now. Is it sufficient for a country like Nigeria or Angola or any other oil-dependent country to balance its budgets? Okay, so the price of oil is important to different groups of persons, depending on where they sit on the energy landscape. Then there's energy supply. Who are the new players on the scene? Where will supply come from? If you're looking at oil and gas, is it going to come from deep water? Is it going to come from the shore? Is it going to come from the swamp? If you are looking at renewable resources, where are you going to be placing your solar panels? What areas have the best wind resources? to supply? Do we even want to tap into those sorts of resources? Okay. And the supply, is it going to be sufficient to meet our demand going forward? Then there's geopolitics. It still plays a big influence on, the energy demand and even energy supply. What's the impact on energy security? We saw how Europe has tried to pivot away from Russian supplied gas. It's a geopolitical decision. We see the US putting pressure on India to, turn away from Russian oil supply because of a geopolitical tack or, maneuver that the US wants to conduct, in that theater. It's a geopolitical thing. Or we see even within West African region, for example, we see the decision to move a pipeline from Niger through Benin Republic to Tidewater have been asked, on several occasions, why wasn't Nigeria a part of this conversation, right? That was a geopolitical issue. And on and on and on. There are several examples you can pick up to support or showcase how geopolitics influences the energy landscape. Then there are different outlooks. Every year, the IEA just released their outlook on world energy outlook to the future. In there, it's a massive 400 plus page document that tells you what the future of energy is going to look like to 2050. What the IEA produces is going to be different from what the EIA sees, and it's going to be different from what OPEC says, and it's going to be different from what maybe Woodman might put out there. So there are different outlooks. The question is, what is driving these outlooks? Why are they different? And it's an important question because policy advisors or people that rely on decision makers that rely on people like myself to give them advice on what the energy future is going to look like are relying on us to go through these reports and distill the essence of these reports. Now, if we can't seem to get a cohesive picture of the energy future, how then do we properly advise and say, well, this is what we think we should be doing, right? And then there are the company strategies. Companies are responding and sometimes even reacting to all of these changes on the global scene. So these factors are interacting in a very complex web to shape the outline of what we see as our energy landscape. And it ends up complicating decision making, as we see on this slide, for example. So what exactly do we mean by volatility, uncertainty, and complexity? Well, the graphic on the right just kind of like captures the spirit of it. You've got oil price volatility, from January 15 to around 2025, January 2025, and it captured the COVID years. And you will see high level of volatility that you notice around that COVID period. Sorry, let me get my pointer here. Good. So you can see a high period of volatility that you would have noticed around COVID years, highlighting that oil prices are, have a lot of volatility and uncertainty in them. Post-COVID effects, the Russian-Ukraine war, for example, oil price changes, energy demand tightening, tightening oil supply, sorry. These are all indicators of what a VUCA world looks like. Then to add to this, you had the newly elected Donald Trump, who's been in power since January. It's less than a year, but it feels like a very long time because of all the things that have happened in this 10-month or so period. Tariffs have had significant effect, and we've watched also the sorts of meetings that the president has had with different world leaders in the Oval Office, from Zelensky through to the South African president, through to the British Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister. Everything has been, theatrical, dramatical, and every move leads to changes on the energy scene. And one of the changes that we saw, from all of Trump's moves was a sharp response in the S&P, which was the stock markets essentially. So it led to a significant drop in those markets. And as far as energy is concerned, Trump came in with the idea of drill, baby drill, which is he was going to go all in to support the energy industry, especially the conventional oil and gas energy industry. And to that extent, there were a lot of executive orders that were passed, and in the first few days, first 3 months really of his presidency, we see that there were a lot of executive orders quickly signed, 6 of which were focused on energy. He withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, fast-track LNG projects, prioritized the approval of critical energy infrastructure. He opened up federal lands for drilling. is looking for ways to lower consumer prices, and then he put a stop to offshore wind leasing. He calls them very ugly. So for those that are in that space, it was a bit of a problem because now you've got this executive order putting a stop to those developments. So this is the kind of thing that we have set for what the world is going to look like. And then in describing the energy landscape, energy transition has also been one of the things that has been very critical on that scene. And the graphic on the left is really just showing us indicatively how energy transition has changed or wound its way through our, general lexicon. We see that from 2020 thereabouts, you see the use of energy transition as a term quickly rose. So it became more discussed if you are listening to internet chatter, right? However, in current times, there's been some slowdown around this conversation. So the US, like I mentioned, has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. The court issued a $660 million verdict against Greenpeace, which is considered to be major given who Greenpeace is. The world is lagging implementation of carbon policies. I mean, you only need to take a look at the map from Carbon Tracker to see this. Energy prices we hear are spiking in Europe. As a result, a lot of the blame is put at the foot of the penetration of renewables into the electric grid. And we saw what happened with Spain, and a lot of reports and studies are still being done on that. Germany is restarting coal plants. The IEA is accused of climate advocacy. So a lot of people are now looking at it that the energy transition isn't really an energy transition. It looks like an energy addition because energy use is increasing, but it is being increasingly met from fossils. The share of fossils isn't dropping, so to speak, as has been expected. And it leads to different outlooks in terms of, okay, how do you see what energy demand is going to look like? Well, different outlooks show you that energy demand is going to be increasing into the future. The uncertainty is in the range. So if you take this graphic, you see that, for example, by 2050, the EIA says 900 exajoules of global energy demand into the future. Whereas if you go with the IEA's projection, they put it at around 720. And if you also look at the share of fossils in that demand, all of them are pointing downwards, with the IEA, of course, expecting there to be a sharper decline in the contribution of fossils to overall global energy demand. And the EIA is interestingly even more bullish than OPEC on the level of on the level of fossils, the contribution of fossils to overall energy demand. The summary of this picture is that however view you look at, energy demand is going to increase. And as a matter of fact, in 2024, it grew by 2.2%, faster than the average rate over the past decade. So between 2023 and 2024, the rate at which energy demand grew had surpassed the average the last 10 years. So that is significant. I should tell you something about the future of energy. And then when it comes down to oil and gas specifically, and I just focus on oil and gas here, there's also difference in outlooks. IEA has just released a new outlook which captures a different scenario. But if you look at the scenarios previously from their steps scenario coupled with OPEC and EIA, we see different views. Okay, the EIA, which is the U.S. Energy Administration, seeing oil at 110. OPEC sees it at 120. The IEA has a more conservative outlook of 97 million barrels a day. Although their new outlook or new scenario, which was just released, actually sees oil at around 113 million barrels a day. So, however you look at it, the views are different. At least OPEC and the EIA agree that oil demand is going to increase from where it is today. And the same story is we can see for gas, right? So gas is also projected to increase up to 540 BCF a day. And for gas, it's particularly interesting because it's increasingly seen as a key component of meeting our electricity demand driven by AI and data centers and what have you. Then this here is a picture of electricity demand, right? Historically, we see electricity demand has almost risen like in a straight line from 2000 in the last 25 years or so. Today it sits at around 30,000 terawatt hours, which is massive. The key thing to take away from here is that bulk of this electricity is still being produced from fossils, oil, gas, and coal, right? Well, not oil really, but gas and coal with a bit of oil in there. Um, Solar and wind are still on the increase, as you can see from here, but have not yet made a significant dent. Taking overall, today's global electricity demand today is supplied around to the extent of around 60% by fossils. So if you take electricity demand coupled with the other end use energy sources that you have, where oil and gas, coal still dominate, you see that fossils are still very strong on the scene. And electricity demand is also seen to be on the increase going forward. So we're looking at a 33% jump between now and 2030, right? That's the level to which electricity is expected to increase. So the summary of this last couple of slides is that we're looking at an energy landscape that is characterized by increasing energy demand going forward. Okay? But what's driving energy demand? There are several factors. There's economic growth, which is putting up upward pressure on demand. Because as economies grow, people earn more. They, of course, want to spend, more comfortable. There's an increased level of urbanization. When people move from rural into urban, of course, their energy use increases significantly, right? Because now they have access to, electricity, cooling, all the nice things of life, like you may want to put it. Then there is an expanding middle class. Okay. This is the class that would buy more cars, go on vacations. They would like to have their air conditioners turned on, or if they live in very cold regions, turn their heating up. And all of those things put pressure on energy demand. They draw on energy demand, right? Then there's digital services. Yes, we see a lot of increase in the use of AI. Any search you run on your system now is drawing on that data center resource, which is going to be powered by electricity at the back end. And the electricity is going to come from somewhere. It's going to be gas, it might be coal, or it might be solar or wind, right? But whatever it is, it's going to be powered by energy. So you can't escape it, even if you are in the AI space. Then improved economy-wide energy efficiencies is also seen to drive demand. So it's a paradoxical thing where energy efficiency is supposed to reduce the amount of energy you use for every unit of activity or any unit of economic activity you want to carry out. But we have found something called Javon's paradox, where as you improve efficiencies, people tend to use more of the resource. And this is well documented. The effect is that as we improve efficiencies, we are going to be increasing our energy use. And then, of course, there's population growth. And then extreme weather events are also calling for increased energy use, which will put pressure on heating and cooling. This is what drives energy demand. And how is this energy supply going to be made? Well, this here is a graphic showing us comparatively how the US stacks up. So a lot of the supply is going to be coming up from, like we saw in a few graphs away, a few slides away rather, you are going to be seeing a lot of energy supply coming from, fossils. That's going to be happening into the future. Solar and wind are also making an inroad. But like I have pointed out, the challenge that the energy transition and climate change policies are facing around the world, we're just talking about the situation in Canada, for example, we see that there may be a throttling or a slowdown in the penetration of those alternative sources of energy. Plus, and I'm just digressing a bit here, you see that the bulk of that demand or the penetration in the use of solar and other renewables really comes down to China at the end of the day. So when we say globally, this is happening, the truth and reality of it is that the bulk of it is happening in China. So China has concentrated, or the concentration of this development is really in China. And you can then argue and question if really it's a global thing or if it's a thing happening in China for, Chinese energy security purposes. But here we see supply coming from the US, and not only oil, but gas as well. the US, from a place nowhere a few years ago, today has shot up and is a leading supplier of oil and gas. And then there are other sources that have come online. We see Guyana, Mozambique is lined up to deliver LNG. Namibia is also a frontier region that is looking attractive. Senegal, the same thing. So at the end of it, what this is saying to us is that supply is now being seriously reconfigured by what is going on in the US and other factors such as the cost of supply, the reserves you have, OPEC production, and their decisions. What we see as demand and above ground risks are all going to shape how the supply is going to come, who is going to supply, and at the price the supply would happen. So I've just painted for us the scene. I've painted the picture of demand. I've also painted a big picture of what the supply looks like. The next thing now is to address the question of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Where do these come from? One of the sources of this complexity and ambiguity we see is the mixed messaging coming out of different quarters. So here, there's a quote from the OPEC Secretary General, where he's emphasizing that the narrative has shifted from energy transitions to looking for other sustainable pathways, taking into account the realities of the ground and the views of the populations, right? And he was saying this, the context within which he was saying this is, you have to understand this was within the context of the elections that had just taken place in Europe at the time, where a lot of the green parties or parties that were in support of climate change and environmental agenda were swept out of office, in those elections. And this is the point that he was making, that people are getting worried and tired of those kind of policies and the impact on their pocketbooks, right? But on the other hand, you have Fatih Birol, who is the head of the IEA, saying that he does not believe that energy security and climate change cannot go hand in hand. In fact, he believes that the world does not need to choose between the two, and that you can actually have both. You can have energy security and you can have, can do something about the climate. Essentially, is what he's saying. And this has been this has been the agenda or the view of the IEA to date. And then you have, Republicans in the US who look at the IEA and say, well, the IEA now is simply a climate lobby. They are forgotten their main mandate and have now become cheerleaders for climate advocacy groups. And in fact, it was this pressure that led the IEA to change some of its or to include some other scenarios in their most recent report. So Barrasso, who was, I think, the key author of that report of the US position against the IEA, said that the IEA in recent years has been undermining energy security by discouraging sufficient investment in energy supplies. And this led the IEA to now produce a report talking about decline rates in oil and gas production around the world. This was released, I think, a month or two before they released their IEA report on the World Energy Outlook. So you can see that different messages from these powerful actors can confuse investors or confuse decision makers who are not so close to these issues, but still need to make decisions that depend on the outcome of these issues. And here is an example too of where mixed messaging has fed into policy and caused risk in investment. So this is a project in Canada, the LNG Canada. You may have heard about it. You find projects, or you find views saying on one hand that the project is, it's not worth going for it. And then on the other hand, you have, others say, well, it's going to bring in billions and it's going to bring investment and what have you. Same project, different outlook, driven by divergent outlooks on what the future of energy is going to look like, and taking different readings on what the geopolitical temperature looks like. The outcome of this, the result is that it creates an environment that is very risky for investment. It denies opportunity for growth, and it leads to, it impacts on social political cohesion, because it is arguments like this that can even begin to tear at the fabric. And in the case of Canada specifically, this has led to a lot of heated debate and argument of different provinces and their place within the union or confederation, as it's called. So the energy question is not just something that technocrats and policy people deal with. It has real economic and societal consequences on everyday people, right? This can also create supply risks and energy supply risks, as I've talked about, because you have conflicting messages that need to be communicated to decision makers. And if you are not able to communicate one way or the other, what should policy actually be, then you run the risk of creating confusion and not making progress. Then geopolitical shocks also have their impact on oil price. So this here just captures what volatility, oil price volatility looks like mapped to different events around the world. Clearly, there was the 1979 price shock. There were periods of recession, the Iraqi war. You had right down to the financial crisis in 2008. Then there was the Libyan crisis, and then Russia-Ukraine invasion, and on, right? So geopolitical events are also to blame for some of the oil price shocks that you experience with oil price and with gasoline pricing. If you are, if you live in a jurisdiction where gasoline price moves very strongly with that of oil price. So what does this mean for Africa or for Nigeria in terms of keeping the lights on? Because now we've talked about demand, we've talked about supply, we've looked a bit about some of the things that drive volatility and uncertainty around the world and around the energy space. So what does it mean for Nigeria specifically and maybe Africa more broadly? The fundamental truth is that energy drives development, and you can see this clearly laid out in this graphic. Energy use per capita is associated with better economic outcomes. For a place like Nigeria, even within Africa, there's still a lot of opportunity for energy use to be accomplished. So we find that the difference between Nigeria and, say, South Africa in terms of energy use is very significant. Where you've got Nigeria like 780 and South Africa at almost 3,000 kilograms of oil equivalent per capita. So this is a significant gap. And the presence of this gap explains some of the challenges we have in Nigeria with respect to our economic development, with respect to social cohesion, with respect to some of the security challenges that we even have. And then the graphic from the Economist is also very stark, telling you, comparing the per capita use of energy in Africa to what a household fridge in the US looks like. So that's the US energy consumption right there. Australia, France, and then right there, that's a household fridge. And then look where Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, these are significant economies of the African continent. So it just tells you the level of the gap or the chasm that needs to be breached as far as energy is concerned. And without addressing this gap, it becomes very difficult to achieve the aspirations we have for economic growth and solve some of the pressing societal problems that we are plagued with. This here is also another, illustration of the kind of opportunity there is in Africa. Very quickly, I'll just explain that this map really is showing you the difference in per capita refined products consumption. Okay, so the orange line is speaking about the consumption, and the blue line is talking about the refinery throughput. The gray represents how much Africa needs to import into the continent to be able to meet its needs. The story here is that there's a deficit of around 0.6 barrels per capita every year, which needs to be met by imports. As of 2023, the latest for which I have this number, Africa imported $104 billion worth of refined products. Now that's massive outflow from the continent that could have been domesticated here. And this is perhaps one of the things that has been noted by the Dangote business to have set up the refinery. And that is the value capture that the refinery is looking at. And it's also interesting to note that even as Africa has this significant gap in terms of the energy, the refined products it consumes, the current level of consumption at around 1 barrel is even the least in the group of countries, where the next highest is Asia Pacific at 3.4. So it just tells you on the ranking where Africa sits in terms of the per capita consumption of refined products. I did a quick calculation at some point and said that if Africa were to achieve parity with Asia of 3.4 barrels per day of refined products consumption, you would need to increase oil production by at least 10 million barrels a day to be able to meet that gap. So let me take that again. For Africa to consume refined products at the same per capita level as the Asia Pacific, globally you will need to increase oil production by 10 million barrels a day from its current level just to meet that demand. So that should give you some sort of context of, okay, energy demand going forward. If you assume that, unless you are going to assume that, well, you don't want to meet those improved energy consumption needs of 1.4 billion people on the African continent, or you're going to look for another way to replace the need for refined products with something else and the associated infrastructure that goes with it, then you're looking at a substitution type of economics. But if you're looking at, matching those consumption levels, then that's the kind of, oil production that you need to bring on the scene to be able to meet it. Okay. Putting that story in a different way for Nigeria, I'll just summarize this one, is that if you look at energy consumption between Nigeria and the world average, the summary is that Nigeria's energy consumption needs to increase by something like 9 exajoules. If you don't think in exajoules, in barrel oil terms, that's like 4 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. So in other words, it's like saying that all the energy consumed in Nigeria needs to increase by 4 million barrels a day of oil. So if you convert all the energy that Nigeria uses, the increase you need to have is around 4 million barrels of oil a day. Of course, if you now begin to divide it up into the different sources of energy, you'll find that electricity needs to go up by 700 terawatt hours, which is a lot, considering that currently Nigeria consumes around 40 terawatt hour of energy, electricity. Right? Refined products needs to go up by almost 2 million barrels a day. Gas needs to go up by like 5 BCF. So the summary of this is that as far as our energy consumption is concerned as a country, there's a lot of headroom for Nigeria's energy consumption to grow, and the needed investment that needs to, go in there to deliver the economic growth, a healthy populace, to ease the social tensions that we have in the country requires energy consumption to increase. And not just energy consumption for the lack of having energy to consume. It's energy consumption that is meant to go into, factories, industrial processes, and to support the economy more broadly. Of course, you are not just going to have energy for the sake of energy. The energy needs to go into something on the economy, right, to be able to drive some of these economic outcomes. So how are the companies responding to these changes? Well, this here just shows us some of the things that they are doing. Capital discipline, low carbon gas development, and returning of a lot of dividends to shareholders seems to be what the majors are doing, right? So Shell is looking to return Shell is looking to return cash returns to shareholders at between 30 to 50% levels. ExxonMobil wants to increase its production because they are bullish on it. Aramco is going to be focused on upstream preeminence, downstream integration, promoting local content or national champions. And then, of course, they also have something about lower carbon initiatives, which really comes down to developing gas or solar farms and what have you. So these are some of the ways the big internationals are responding. And when you come down to Nigeria, how do we see some of this response? You see a lot of mergers and acquisitions taking place, assets changing hands, more indigenous acquisition of IOC assets, and this is the continuation of a long trend in transferring ownership and transferring responsibility and national development and growth into homegrown hands. Okay, so now we know what the story is. What can we do? What are the options? What are the strategies that we need to adopt? I won't take us through the details of all that is on this slide, but just to highlight that there are 6 things that that I consider that are important to help progress the way forward. One is capital infusion, without which you cannot develop any of these assets. You cannot increase production and sustain it. You cannot expand the electricity grid. You cannot think about other sources of energy, right? Then there needs to be integration of operations. Then you're going to be able to have more efficiencies, reduce carbon intensities, for example, and meet some of the climate commitments that Nigeria has signed up to, which I should also state Nigeria has been very faithful in signing up to climate commitments. And to out of interest, I was looking at the carbon tracker map of the different carbon policies or climate policies of different countries around the world. And interestingly, Nigeria's is almost sufficient. And other leading countries are not even there. So it just tells you that, perhaps we have maybe overcommitted to the climate change rules, so to speak. If I would say, if you allow me to say that, maybe say overcommitted, because we're even way ahead of other countries in terms of meeting sufficiency. Okay. Then sector reform. Of course, we need to have some sector reforms, monitor the synergy between policy, operations, and commercial, deal with some of the governance issues that we have, obtain the necessary social license to operate. These are very key to having that energy supply. Then there's energy security. Okay, uh, because we are looking at climate change and energy transition going forward, doesn't mean that oil and gas is something that we should move away from. We had that issue with coal, and look at what it is today. So oil and gas is still something that's going to be relevant and critical for our energy security. In economy-wide efficiencies, and innovative deployment of technology. So these are some of the ideas that I think on a thematic level that I think need to be implemented to enhance our way forward. As far as investment is concerned, why do we need to do investments? And again, I won't go through all of this in depth, but suffice to say that, of course, we require that investment to support our energy production and distribution. You need to be able to assure supply, grow the industry, capture market share, take equity acquisitions, make equity acquisitions in companies of interest, expand our supply chains, move into other verticals, mining, minerals refining, and equipment, drive economy-wide efficiencies. You need investment to be able to do that. You're not just going to become an efficient economy by pronouncing it. You actually need to drive, you actually need to put investments to drive that efficiency. Of course, you need investments to be able to mitigate risks. Okay, there are some risks that are going to materialize from supply. To create alternative supply, you need to make the investments to do so. So energy investments will ensure that supply keeps up with our increasing demand. Here is a graphic just to illustrate the point that, alongside with global capex trends, Nigeria's capex has also been in decline. Currently, Nigeria of 2021, Nigeria's capex spend was the equivalent of $16 for every $1,000 spent globally. This was a significant drop from $6 for every 1,000 barrels spent, so every $1,000 on global capex spent. Austin Avuru thinks we need somewhere between 20 and 25 billion sustained annually to stabilize our production level at 2 million barrels a day, 10 BCF a day of gas. So this kind of like begins to give you an idea of the sort of investments that are needed to drive the energy requirements and even fiscal requirements of Nigeria. Even as much as this need is there, at the end of the day, when you look at a map of investments around the world, and this is taken out of the IEA's World Energy Investments 2025, you see that Africa still makes up a very small portion of the energy investments distribution around the world globally. So Africa's share of fossil investment is $61 billion out of 1.1 trillion, which comes down to something like 6%. And even when it comes to renewables, Africa still is falling very short at $46 billion out of 2.2 trillion. And interestingly, where do you have most of the fossil investments? Well, it's in China, it's in the US, in the Middle East, it's in Eurasia, it's in Latin America, right? Clean investments is dominated by China, US, and EU. So it's almost a paradox. There's not enough investment to do the oil and gas, and there's not enough investment to transition away from the oil and gas, which is not a very nice place to be in. So this submits that at the end of the day, we have significant capex needs to grow the supply, to drive the economy, deal with some of the societal challenges that we have, deal with the level of insecurity we have in the country, create employment, ease social tensions, even create political stability within the country as well. Because the absence of the energy supply leads to weak economies that then lead to very poor social outcomes and even the health of the citizens. So, by way of closing, I would just like to highlight these few key takeaways. Point out that the energy landscape is defined today by energy transition, demand and supply, oil price volatility, geopolitical tensions, divergent outlooks, different strategies of the players. It's now politically sensitive. And of course, we can't help but mention that Donald Trump has also made a very big splash in the scene. Energy transition is not progressing as we envisaged. It's slower and looks more like an energy addition. This realization has created the expectation that oil and gas will still be on the scene for some decades to come. Africa, meanwhile, still has a lot of headroom to grow its consumption of energy. And Africa alone can actually prop up global demand by 10 million barrels a day to achieve per capita consumption at parity with Asia. Okay. Nigeria on its own, like I pointed out, requires an increment of like 4 million barrel oil equivalent per day of energy consumption to achieve parity with global averages. Capex spend for energy in Nigeria has declined along with global trend. And this is something that needs to reverse for us to be able to mitigate or insulate ourselves from the VUCA world out there. Sustainable energy production would require capital infusion, efficiency, innovative use of digital technologies, policy stability, and what have you. At the end of the day, it all behoves on us to aim for cost efficiency and diligence in meeting our fiscal obligations and strengthening the governance processes around our energy system. Okay. So this is where I would land our presentation. I want to thank you very much for listening. I welcome questions. We can then have our discussions around, we can then share around what the future of energy looks like and other ideas on how to mitigate and work mitigate the risks of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Thank you very much.